250,000 German and Romanian corpses recovered in the surroundings of a single city, more than 1,100,000 Soviet casualties in a single campaign. 82 days of combat on a Pacific island where between 1 in 4 and 1 in 3 inhabitants who lived there before the war died. And in Berlin, the capital of a collapsing Reich, 78,000 Soviet soldiers dead in 16 days, in the streets of a city that, since January, already knew it was going to fall. Even so, none of those numbers answer the question. Because the question is a trick. When someone asks what the bloodiest battle of the Second World War was, they assume there is a single, clean, orderly answer, inscribable on a marble tombstone. But history does not work like that. The answer depends on what you measure. It depends on whether you count military or civilians. It depends on whether you consider daily intensity or the cumulative total. It depends on whether a battle is a city, a front, or an entire continent turned into a continuous extermination field for 4 years. Before entering into the numbers, the framework must be established. Because without it, any comparison is dishonest. A battle can be bloody in 3 completely different ways, and each way gives a different answer. The first, the total of dead and wounded on both sides, adding up the entire campaign. With this criterion, long and extensive battles always exceed short and intense ones, even though in the short ones the probability of dying per hour was 100 times greater. The second, daily intensity. How many fell per hour? How long a soldier lasted before being knocked out of combat? This metric captures something the total does not capture. The concentrated horror, the impossibility of surviving in a specific place during a specific period of time. The week of August 1942 on the banks of the Volga, or the first 4 days of the Soviet operation on the Silo Heights in April 1945, produce hourly mortality figures that are physically difficult to process. The third, the impact on civilians. In the Second World War, violence against the non-combatant population was not collateral damage in most cases. It was deliberate policy, part of the objective, instrumentalized as a tool of war. The battles where this occurred most systematically are, in terms of total human suffering, the costliest of all. And then there is the problem of geographical and temporal limits. Where does Stalingrad end, and where does the summer campaign of 1942 begin? Is the Battle of Berlin only the 9 days of urban combat, or does it include operations on the Oder Heights since the 16th of April 1945? When does the Battle of Okinawa begin? When the first reconnaissance forces arrived on March 26th, or when the main landing began on April 1st? Depending on what line you draw on the map and on the calendar, the numbers change radically. And finally, the most uncomfortable question of all, is it legitimate to compare Stalingrad with the Eastern Front as a whole? The second encompasses the first, and the Eastern Front encompasses, in terms of scale, everything else together. All this is not historical relativism, it is precision. And precision here does not soften the horror, it amplifies it. In October 1942, an officer of a German panzer unit wrote in his diary, "Stalingrad is no longer a city. Animals flee from this hell. The hardest stones cannot endure it for long. Only men resist." It was a phrase with the coldness of exhaustion, not the warmth of heroism, and it described with stark precision what had occurred in the previous 2 months. What would come after would be worse. The Battle of Stalingrad formally began on July 17, 1942, when advanced units of the German Army of the South clashed with Soviet forces in the Great Bend of the Don, about 150 kilometers northwest of the city. But the real urban combat, the one that has defined the name of Stalingrad in collective memory, began on August 23, 1942, when the Luftwaffe, under the command of Colonel General Wolfram von Richthofen, launched one of the most intense aerial bombardments of the entire war on a city that remained full of civilians. Between the 25th and 31st of July, even before the direct ground assault, 32 Soviet ships were sunk in the Volga and another 9 severely damaged by German air attacks. When the bombardment of August 23rd reached its maximum intensity, The sky burned orange. Huge columns of black smoke rose for hours. The Volga, on whose banks the city stretched for nearly 50 kilometers, was covered in flaming fuel from the ignited oil depots. Estimates of civilians killed on that single-day range in the tens of thousands. The city the Germans wanted to conquer was reduced in a matter of hours to a field of rubble. But there was something in that destruction that Richthofen did not foresee. The ruins were, for the defender, an enormous tactical advantage. Lieutenant General Vasily Ivanovich Chuikov took command of the 62nd Soviet Army on September 11, 1942, when the situation was desperate. German forces had already reached the river. Some sectors of the Volga bank had fallen into German hands. The depth of the territory defended by Chuikov was measured in hundreds of meters at some points. There were literally streets where, if you fell on the wrong side, you reached the water. Chuikov was 42 years old. He had fought in the Russian Civil War and the Soviet-Finnish War. He was known for the ferocity of his temperament and for the absolute discipline he imposed. In his memoirs, he describes having personally beaten more than one officer who tried to retreat without an express order. But what defined the defense of Stalingrad was his specific tactical genius. His solution to the problem of facing the Wehrmacht, which operated with overwhelming superiority in artillery and aviation, was what he termed hugging the enemy, sticking the Soviet lines so close to the German lines that the Nazi artillery and planes could not bomb without killing their own. Chuikov's doctrine turned every building into a fortress, each floor into a separate battlefield, every staircase into a death corridor. Because if the Germans used aviation in that combat at 30 meters distance, they bombed their own positions. The 62nd Army used more grenades during the Battle of Stalingrad than in all the rest of the war combined. The result was combat of a brutality without parallel on the Western Front. Soviet and German soldiers fought for individual rooms, for sewage pipes, for the control of a single window looking onto a ruined courtyard. Chuikov organized his defenses to create killing zones in the streets. Fortified buildings channeled German columns into alleys swept by mines and camouflaged anti-tank artillery. When enemy infantry and armor entered these traps, mortar fire separated them, and both components were eliminated separately. In the Barricadi factory complex, Soviet and German lines were sometimes separated by less than 30 meters for entire weeks. Mamayev Kurgan, the mound marked on maps as Hill 102, which dominated the city's skyline and access to the river, changed hands numerous times. The Germans attempted to take it up to 12 times in a single day. At the end of the battle, the earth of the mound was so impregnated with shrapnel and bones that for years it was impossible to grow anything on it. Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building located near the river, became one of the best-known symbols of the battle. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and a small group of soldiers took the building on September 27, 1942, and held it against all German attacks for 58 days, until German positions were overrun by Operation Uranus. General Chuikov documented that in that period the defenders of that single building caused more casualties to the enemy than Germany had in the entire French campaign in 1940. Snipers operated in both directions. The most famous of the Soviets was Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev from the village of Yelenino in the Ural Mountains, Chelyabinsk region. Before the war, he had been a woodsman and hunter. In Stalingrad, between October and December 1942, he accumulated more than 225 confirmed kills with a Mosin Nagant model 1891 sniper rifle. He also formed a sniper school within the Soviet lines, training dozens of shooters who operated in the city perimeter for months. Zaitsev survived the entire war and died in Kiev in 1991. 10 days before the collapse of the Soviet Union. The average duration of a newly arrived Soviet soldier in the Stalingrad sector in the fall of 1942 was less than 24 hours, according to data compiled by military sources of the time. Some complete units were decimated in 72 hours. Lieutenant General Chuikov sent units from the eastern bank of the Volga, which was the only resupply area, directly into combat. Sometimes without terrain orientation, sometimes without knowing exactly in what position they should report. They crossed the river at night to reduce losses to aerial bombardments, which during the day made movement impossible. But on the Volga, it was already snowing, and there were floating blocks of ice, and the boats were hit by German artillery. Chuikov calculates in his memoirs that during the worst moments of October and November 1942, his forces lost approximately 10,000 men per week, and more kept arriving. On November 19, 1942, at 3 in the morning, on a dawn with a temperature of -18 degrees Celsius and fog so dense that artillery observers could barely see 200 meters, the Red Army launched Operation Uranus. It was the counterstroke that Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov and Colonel General Alexander Mikhailovich Vasilevsky, chief of the General Staff, had been preparing in secret for months while German forces bled in the streets of Stalingrad. The plan was classic in its geometry and monstrous in its scale, a double envelopment. The southwestern front of Lieutenant General Nikolai Fyodorovich Vatutin would attack from the north. The Stalingrad front of General Andrei Ivanovich Yeremenko would do the same from the south. The two arms would close like a pincer around the German Sixth Army of General Friedrich Paulus. The key to the plan was to attack not the German divisions hardened by urban combat, but the flanks covered by Germany's allies, the Third Romanian Army to the north and the Fourth Romanian Army to the south. The Romanian divisions lacked effective anti-tank artillery against the Soviet T-34s. They lacked adequate communications. They lacked, in many cases, the motivation to die for a war that was not theirs. When the Soviet tanks opened breaches of dozens of kilometers on the first day, there was no German reserve capable of closing them in time. According to data documented by David M. Glantz and Jonathan M. House in Endgame at Stalingrad, University of Kansas, 2014, the total strength of the Southwestern Front on November 19, 1942, amounted to 389,902 men with a combat strength of 331,984, backed by 8,655 guns and mortars, 721 operational tanks, and 359 combat aircraft. The artillery preparation prior to the attack lasted 80 minutes, with fire densities that Soviet archives described as unprecedented on the Southwestern Front to that date. Stalin demanded absolute secrecy from the planners. Troop movements were carried out only at night with mandatory radio silence, and roads were swept of suspicious persons by the NKVD in a 25-kilometer strip behind the start lines. The Stalingrad pocket was closed on November 23, 1942, when a reconnaissance column of Lieutenant Colonel Georgy Filipov's mechanized brigade joined with forces from the Stalingrad front at Savetsky, cutting all of Paulus's land supply lines. Approximately 284,000 Axis soldiers were enclosed according to the most conservative calculations from the Soviet archives reviewed by Glantz, although some sources raise that figure to more than 300,000. The German Sixth Army, more than half of the Fourth Panzer Army, and remains of Romanian units were trapped in a pocket of land where the temperature fell to -40 degrees in January and supplies were insufficient even before the encirclement. Hitler prohibited surrender. He said that no German Feldmarschall had ever surrendered. Then he promoted Paulus to that rank the night before the capitulation, taking for granted that this would force him to commit suicide rather than surrender. He was wrong. Operation Winter Storm, the rescue attempt by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, began on December 12th with Army Group Hoth advancing from the south. It reached 48 kilometers from the perimeter of the Kessel, the German name for the cauldron, the enclosure pocket before being contained and finally stopped by reinforced Soviet forces. It never reached closer. The men inside the encirclement could see the flashes of Manstein's artillery on the horizon on clear December nights. Paulus knew that 48 kilometers was too far. The Sixth Army died of cold, hunger and combat for 10 more weeks. Horses were eaten before dogs. Dogs were eaten before rats. Rats ate the dead. Lieutenant Hans Oettel, captured in the final weeks and who left written testimony, described soldiers who no longer had a recognizable uniform because all the cloth had been wrapped around their limbs to avoid freezing, and who moved in formations of 10 men not for tactics but because 10 bodies together generate more heat than one alone. On January 31st, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, newly promoted to Feldmarschall the previous night by personal order of Hitler, surrendered in the basement of the Univermag department store in Stalingrad. Second Lieutenant Fyodor Ilchenko and the men of the 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade were the ones who reached the basement and found the Feldmarschall. Ilchenko wrote that Paulus was sitting in a chair, his face covered with unshaven beard for days, and that he barely reacted when they told him he was a prisoner. It was the first time a German Feldmarschall fell prisoner to the enemy. 2 days later, on February 2nd, 1943, the last redoubt of resistance in the northern sector of the city, the 11th Army Corps of General Karl Strecker, capitulated. Of the 91,000 soldiers who surrendered in those final weeks, the most cited estimate is that only between 5,000 and 6,000 returned to Germany. Most did so between 1953 and 1955, a decade after the end of the war. The rest died in Soviet labor and prison camps, of cold, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Some in the first days of captivity, when they were forced to march hundreds of kilometers in sub-zero temperatures without adequate clothing. Paulus survived and testified at the Nuremberg trials. He died in Dresden in 1957. The total figures of the campaign, which includes the fighting from July 17, 1942, until the surrender of February 2, 1943, are what turned Stalingrad into what it is. According to the Encyclopaedia Britannica and multiple updated academic sources, Axis casualties, Germans, Romanians, Italians and Hungarians, are estimated at more than 800,000 among dead, wounded, missing and captured, of which the bodies of some 250,000 German and Romanian soldiers were recovered on the ground. Soviet casualties documented in Russian military records amount to 1,129,619, including 478,741 dead or missing and 650,878 wounded. Civilian deaths inside the city are calculated at least 40,000. The combined total is around 2 million casualties in 200 days, in a single city on the banks of a river, in the largest war in history. To understand what made Stalingrad so lethal, one must look beyond urban combat. The debacle of the German Sixth Army was not just a military defeat. It was the product of strategic decisions accumulated over months that turned Stalingrad into a trap from which Paulus had no possible exit. Operation Blue, the code name for the Great German Offensive of the summer of 1942, had as its main objective not the city on the Volga, but the oil fields of the Caucasus. Stalingrad was, in the original conception, a secondary objective whose capture would serve to protect the northern flank of the advance toward the south. But the name of the city, which bore the name of Stalin himself, turned the operation into something different. Hitler ordered that Stalingrad be taken. Stalin ordered that Stalingrad be defended. What had begun as a derived strategic objective became the point of greatest concentration of political will for both leaders. The result was that the Sixth Army, the largest and best-equipped force in the German order of battle in the East, with its combat crest earned in more than 2 years of victories, was systematically introduced into urban combat that negated all its advantages. Heavy artillery could not operate in destroyed streets without killing its own forces. Tanks were vulnerable to snipers with anti-armor weapons firing from windows 3 meters away. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated the airspace over the Eastern Front for more than a year, could not bomb when the front line had the width of a brick wall, and meanwhile, the flanks. The 3rd Romanian Army to the north and the 4th to the south, plus the Italian and Hungarian forces covering the Don front, stretched across hundreds of kilometers with very little artillery, very few tanks and variable morale. Glantz and House document in their work that Soviet planners initially estimated that the encirclement would enclose between 85,000 and 99,000 men. The fact that they were 284,000 or more is explained because the 6th Army was larger than Soviet intelligence had calculated, and because Paulus took several days to understand that the encirclement was real and complete. Those days of delay in recognizing the catastrophe cost him the perhaps unique opportunity to break the encirclement through the southern flank before the Soviets consolidated it. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Adam, adjutant to Paulus, wrote in his memoirs that the night he understood the encirclement was definitive, the headquarters of the 6th Army fell silent. There were no shouts, there were no accusations, only the silence of men who know they have reached the end. Operation Uranus also had a logistical dimension that makes the Soviet victory even more notable. The 3 attacking fronts depended on supply routes that included railways of a different gauge than the standard Soviet in newly recovered territories. Studebaker trucks supplied under the American Lend-Lease Act, whose contribution to the Soviet war effort is systematically underestimated in Russian historiography, and improvised bridges over partially frozen rivers. Even so, the Soviet armies maintained the double line of the encirclement for weeks, the inner one tightening the Kessel and the outer one blocking Manstein's rescue attempts. The discipline of secrecy was another determining factor. Glantz documents that Stalin imposed absolute radio silence for all troop movements in the period prior to the offensive. Front commanders could only communicate their orders verbally. The NKVD combed the rear looking for possible spies or deserters who could leak information. The result was that the German General Staff did not detect the true magnitude of the Soviet concentration until the attack began. Colonel General Maximilian Freiherr von Weichs, commander of Army Group B, received the first report that something serious was occurring on the northern flank on November 19, 1942, the same day of the attack at mid-morning. 10,000 kilometers from the Russian steppes, on an island of about 1,200 square kilometers located 550 kilometers south of Kyushu, the southernmost large island of the Japanese archipelago, something occurred that American soldiers called the Typhoon of Steel. The name was given by the Okinawans themselves, not the Americans. On April 1st, 1945, Easter and April Fool's Day at the same time, 60,000 American soldiers and Marines landed on the western beaches of Okinawa in the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific Theater, exceeding in scale even the operations in the North Sea. The first day was eerily quiet. The men advanced without appreciable resistance through the rice fields, took 2 airfields almost without firing. Some veterans of Iwo Jima and Peleliu looked at each other with bewilderment. A Marine infantry officer wrote to his family that day, "This does not look good. When it is easy at the beginning, it is because the enemy is waiting for something." They were right. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Japanese Army in Okinawa, had studied the pattern of North American landings on preceding islands and had reached a conclusion that contradicted orthodox Japanese doctrine. Defending the beaches was wasting men. The Americans had overwhelming superiority in naval and aerial artillery. Any unit on the beaches during the landing would be destroyed in hours. Ushijima would wait in the south, in a system of tunnels, caverns and firing positions built over months in the limestone hill terrain of the southern part of the island. The main defense perimeter was anchored at Shuri Castle, a centuries-old fortress repurposed as the nerve center of the Japanese defensive system. Behind it, dozens of additional defense lines stretched toward the southern tip of the island. The fighting began in earnest on April 6th. That same day, Japan launched the largest kamikaze operation of the war, Operation Kikusui No. 1, with 355 suicide planes against the Allied fleet off the coast. The USS Newcomb, a destroyer, was hit 5 times in a single day. 29 sailors died on it. The next day, another destroyer sank. Kamikaze attacks would continue in successive waves for weeks, numbered from 1 to 10, with a total of nearly 2,000 suicide planes. At the end of the campaign, 26 Allied ships had been sunk and another 164 damaged. U.S. naval casualties in Okinawa were the highest of the entire Pacific War, 4,907 dead, a ratio of 1 dead for every wounded, compared with the 1-to-5 ratio of the Marines on land. On land, the American advance was measured in meters per day. The Makinato Line, the Dakeshi Line, Sugarloaf Hill, hills designated by letters or numbers. Each of these positions cost hundreds of lives. The Japanese had built the defensive system so that each position covered the next. Taking a trench did not open a field of maneuver, but exposed you to fire from 3 lateral positions you had ignored because they were hidden in caves. The Marines discovered that the only way to reduce these positions was with flamethrowers and explosives placed directly at the cave entrances. Sugarloaf Hill, an elevation that looked insignificant on the map, was attacked and retaken 11 times in 11 days in the month of May 1945. The 29th Marine Regiment lost 2,662 men dead in that period, in addition to 1,289 evacuated for combat shock or psychological collapse. The proportion of casualties from combat stress in Okinawa was 48% relative to physical wounds, an unprecedented percentage that military psychiatry scholars like Dr. David Marlowe cited decades later as one of the foundational cases for understanding post-traumatic stress disorder. For comparison, in the Korean War it was 20 to 25%, in the Yom Kippur War 30%. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the American 10th Army and highest-ranking officer in the terrestrial Pacific Theater, died on June 18, 1945, 4 days before the official end of the battle, hit by fragments of Japanese artillery while observing the advance of his troops from an observation post. He was the highest-ranking United States officer fallen to enemy fire in the entire Second World War. At that moment, the campaign was essentially won. Buckner died in the final stretch. The Japanese did not surrender. Lieutenant General Ushijima wrote a formal farewell letter to his superiors in Tokyo, thanking them for the honor of having served the empire, and then committed suicide by seppuku ritual in a cave at the southern tip of the island on June 22, 1945, along with his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho. Of the approximately 100,000 Japanese soldiers who defended Okinawa, between 107,000 and 117,000 died in combat or in the last acts of resistance. Approximately 7,400 were captured, a minority that has no parallel in the Pacific War if measured as a percentage of the total. The percentage of survivors who surrendered was less than 7%. But what puts Okinawa in a separate category is the civilian part. The island had a population of approximately 450,000 inhabitants before the war. It was not Japanese in the conventional historical sense. It had been the Ryukyu Kingdom, an independent state with its own culture and its own language. Ryukyuan, or Uchinaguchi, which the Meiji government of Japan had formally annexed in 1879 through what in official Japanese documents was called the disposition of the kingdom. For many Okinawans, 4 centuries of their own cultural identity separated them from the Japanese of the main archipelago. That distance was, in the war, fatally irrelevant. The Japanese army recruited high school students to serve as combatants or auxiliaries. The Blood and Iron Student Corps, the Teketsu Kinotai, mobilized youths between 14 and 16 years old. Of the 1,500 students mobilized, at least 800 died. Girls from the female high schools were recruited as field nurses in the units called Himayuri, Star Lily. Of the 222 nurses in these brigades, 136 died, aged between 15 and 19, many in the collapse of underground shelters where they had been tending wounded when North American explosives sealed the entrances. The most documented and hardest to integrate horror was another. When Japanese forces retreated toward the south and civilians were trapped between the two armies, the Imperial Army began to systematically propagate the idea that surrender to the Americans was equivalent to a death worse than any other: torture, dismemberment, sexual slavery for women, and castration for men. Some officers distributed grenades among civilian families with explicit instructions. The order, stated or implied depending on the case, was to prefer collective death to capture. In the caverns of the southern part of the island, entire families committed suicide. Fathers killed their children before taking their own lives. Groups of neighbors detonated grenades in enclosed spaces. These deaths were not marginal or isolated. They are the reason why the percentage of civilian deaths in relation to the previous population is so high. Estimates of civilian deaths in Okinawa oscillate, according to the sources consulted, between 100,000 and 150,000. The National Museum of the Pacific War, based in Fredericksburg, Texas, cites the figure of 150,000. The Encyclopedia Britannica estimates at least 100,000. Any of those figures, between 22 and 33% of the entire population of the island before the war, is among the highest recorded for a single short-duration campaign in the Second World War. Total American casualties exceeded 49,000, including more than 12,500 dead, 2,938 from the Marine Infantry, 4,675 from the Army, 4,907 from the Navy. It was the costliest campaign for the United States in the entire Pacific theater, and it was directly what set in motion the decision to use the atomic bombs. Projections of casualties for Operation Olympic, the planned invasion of the island of Kyushu for the fall of 1945, ranged between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties in the most cited calculations, those of General Douglas MacArthur and his intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby. The Japanese government had mobilized approximately 2 million soldiers in Kyushu and had begun to arm the civilian population with bamboos and improvised explosives. The logic of the 49,000 casualties of Okinawa multiplied by the territory and population of the main islands produced projections that American military planners describe in their memoranda as unacceptable but probably inevitable without recourse to some factor that radically changed the calculation. That factor was the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6th and over Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945. 82 days of combat in Okinawa ended by defining that outcome. To understand Okinawa beyond statistics, one must enter the internal logic of the combat. General Ushijima and his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Isamu Cho, represented two different philosophies on how to defend the island. Cho was aggressive, almost impulsive. He wanted continuous counterattacks to push the Americans back to the sea with massive blows. Ushijima was more patient, colder. His objective was not to win the battle, but to inflict as many casualties as possible to disincentivize the invasion of mainland Japan. Ushijima's doctrine was, in brutally direct terms, to kill as many Americans as possible before dying. There was no possible victory. He could only make the defeat more expensive. The result was a battlefield where the defenders chose to cede ground deliberately to draw the attackers into prepared fire zones. Every kilometer taken by the Marines or the Army could be the kilometer where the next hidden position was, the next bunker dug into the rock, the next room of 200 soldiers with enough ammunition to hold out for weeks. Soldiers who fought in Okinawa described a specific phenomenon that veterans of European combat rarely mention, the feeling that the earth itself killed. The entire island was a defense system. The caves were not occasional shelters, but interconnected networks kilometers in length. The Shuri defensive system, the main one, included tunnels that connected positions hundreds of meters apart, allowing defenders to withdraw from an attacked point and reappear on the attacker's flank. E.B. Sledge, a Marine veteran of Peleliu who also fought in Okinawa, described in his memoirs published as With the Old Breed in 1981, how his company took more than a week to understand that the same group of Japanese soldiers they had repeatedly annihilated kept appearing in new positions because they were moving underground. The kamikazes at sea had an equivalent on land. individual suicide charges of Japanese soldiers alone or in small groups against American tanks, using explosive charges strapped to the body. Some carried magnetic bombs they tried to stick to the tank chassis before detonating. Most died without reaching the vehicles. But the psychological effect on the tank crews, who had to stay with hatches closed even in the June heat in Okinawa without adequate visibility, knowing that any figure approaching could be a Rikugun, was devastating. The rains of May and June turned the southern battlefield into something that veterans themselves compared to the Somme of 1916. The limestone terrain, when bombarded, did not absorb water, but repelled it. The mud became between half a metre and a metre deep in some sectors. Tanks got stuck. The wounded drowned in ditches before they could be evacuated. The smell of decomposition, subtropical temperature, with no possibility of burying the dead in the heat of combat, was described by multiple veterans as the thing that most persisted in their memory years later. On June 1st, 1945, the American 17th Army Corps captured Shuri Castle, the center of the main defensive system. Ushijima had ordered the retreat south 2 weeks earlier, preserving enough forces to continue the resistance. The Marines and soldiers who entered the castle ruins found it abandoned but not empty. There were thousands of bodies, Japanese and Okinawan civilians who had died in the tunnels during the combat or bombardments. The final weeks of the battle had a particular ferocity because the defenders, cornered at the southern tip of the island, no longer had strategic options. Only death or surrender, and the doctrine and culture of the Imperial Army made surrender something worse than death. On June 22, 1945, the American commander declared the battle over, but isolated Japanese units continued fighting in the caves for weeks and months. The last Japanese soldier of Okinawa to formally surrender did so in 1947. On April 16, 1945, at 3 a.m. Berlin time, Marshal Georgy Zhukov looked at his watch in the forward command post on the Reitveinskarp over the Oderbruch. The hands marked 5 a.m, Moscow time. He drank his last sip of the strong tea prepared by a soldier named Margot. Then he went outside and waited. What happened next was, in absolute figures, the most intense artillery bombardment of the entire war. General Kazakov had 8,983 pieces of artillery along the main attack sector, a density of approximately 1 gun every 4 meters in the advanced sectors. There were 152mm howitzers, 203mm howitzers, heavy mortars, and entire regiments of Katyusha rocket launchers. The First Belarusian Front had reserves of 7 million shells. On the first day of the operation, April 16, 1945, 1,236,000 were fired, 1,200,000 shells in a single day. The Soviet gunners worked with the muzzles of the cannons glowing, loading and firing at a rhythm that caused the tubes to overheat. They had been ordered to keep their mouths open during the discharges to balance the pressure and not burst their eardrums. A colonel of sappers who observed the bombardment from the other side of the Oder described it in a letter to his family that night. The entire portion of the sky that spanned the east was on fire. On the German side, everything was covered in smoke and large fountains of earth. Huge flocks of terrified birds flew in all directions because of the constant roar. Then Zhukov turned on the 143 anti-aircraft searchlights. The idea was to blind the German defenders. In practice, the beams of light created more problems than they solved. They illuminated the Soviet soldiers themselves from behind, while the smoke and dust raised by the bombardment formed a screen that scattered the light in all directions. Tanks were silhouetted by their own artillery. Captain Suljanishvili of the 3rd Shock Army wrote that the light was so blinding it made it impossible to orient oneself. The Germans on the Silo Heights had survived for another reason. General Gotthard Heinrici, commander of Army Group Vistula, had received information from a Soviet prisoner captured the day before and had ordered most of his forces to withdraw to the second line of trenches before the bombardment. The vanguard positions were nearly empty when the first shells arrived. Those who did not have that luck, detachments of the Volkssturm and Hungarian units sent to the forward trenches of the 30 Januar SS Division as cannon fodder, according to the description of SS Lieutenant Helmuth Schwartz himself, were annihilated. but the main defensive positions remained intact. Zhukov took 4 days to take the Silo Heights, 4 days that were not on the calendar. According to historian Anthony Beaver and the Warfare History Network, at the end of those 4 days the Soviets had lost between 30,000 and 33,000 dead, and the Germans about 12,000 more dead plus 35,000 captured. Only in the assault prior to Berlin, on a front of about 80 kilometers. When Zhukov's armies finally reached the outskirts of Berlin on April 21st, the city they found had already been dying from within for months. Allied bombardments, British by night, American by day, had systematically hit Berlin since 1943. By April 1945, wide sectors of the city were rubble. But the civilian population, which before the war numbered nearly 4 million people, had not evacuated in its entirety. Many could not. Many did not believe the city could fall. Many had stayed because they had small children, because they were elderly, because they were afraid of the roads. Some 2.5 million civilians were still in Berlin when the siege began. Berliners had developed an adaptation to terror that can only be described as normalization of the impossible. Queues to get a ration of butter dissolved when a shell fell in the line and reformed around the crater. A woman who kept a diary published after the war anonymously as a woman in Berlin described how the women in line wiped the blood off their ration cards and kept waiting. "They stand like walls," she wrote, "and they are the same ones who not long ago ran to take shelter in bunkers as soon as the appearance of 3 fighter planes was announced." To defend Berlin, the Third Reich had gathered what remained. The SS Nordland Division, formed by Nordic volunteers, Norwegians, Danes, Swedes, some Dutch and Belgians, fought in the southeast and east sectors of the city with a ferocity that several witnesses attributed to the absence of expectations of surviving, veterans of the Eastern Front who had spent 3 years fighting in Russia. And also, increasingly, youths. Hitler Youth units with ages starting from 14, trained in a few weeks and sent to anti-armor positions. The writer of the anonymous diary saw them on a street and wrote, "Children with tender expressions under huge steel helmets, tiny and scrawny, wearing uniforms too large for them." General Karl Weidling, appointed commander of the Berlin garrison on April 23, 1945, described later that his Panzer Corps had been divided to reinforce Volkssturm detachments. His operational tanks could be counted. Ammunition was scarce. General Steiner, whose counterattack Hitler expected with desperation on the morning of April 22nd to stop the Soviet encirclement from the north, did not attack because he did not have sufficient forces to do so. When Jodl and Keitel communicated this to Hitler at the Situation meeting that noon, it was the first time in the war that Hitler admitted publicly that the battle was lost. What followed was the collapse of the last vestige of rationality in the Reich's command. On April 25th, Berlin was completely encircled. That same day, Soviet and American soldiers met in Torgau on the Elbe. The Reich was cut in two. From that moment, the city was alone. What followed in the next 9 days was a systematic carnage in a space of about 880 square kilometers, the area of Greater Berlin, then with more than 2 million civilians trapped in the middle. 4 Soviet armies operating inside the city at the same time bombarded each other in at least 3 documented incidents. The 600mm siege guns that General Kazakov had transported by special rail-fired half-ton shells. 34 tanks advanced along the main avenues. The Flak Tower's 3 reinforced concrete structures more than 30 meters high with 2-meter thick walls, built in 1940 in the zoo, Friedrichshain and Humboldthain parks fired their 128mm cannons directly at Soviet tanks in the streets. At the lowest level, the combat was identical to that of Stalingrad, but in reverse. Now it was the Soviets who hugged the German lines to avoid bombardments from their own artillery. Vasily Grossman, the writer and journalist attached to Chvikov's 8th Guards Army, walked the streets during those days and described them with his habitual clinical coldness. Some of the dead had succumbed crushed by tanks, squeezed out like tubes of toothpaste. I saw a lifeless old woman, her head resting against a wall, sitting on a mattress near a main door with an expression of quiet and eternal pain. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th, 1945 at 15:30 Berlin time in the bunker under the new Reich Chancellery, along with Eva Braun, whom he had married less than 40 hours before. Their bodies were burned in the Chancellery garden following his own prior instructions. The Reichstag, the building Stalin had designated as the symbolic objective of the conquest, was taken that same night by units of the Soviet Third Shock Army, although the official legend of Yegorov and Kantaria raising the red flag at the top of the building was partially reconstructed for the propaganda photograph days later. On May 2nd, 1945, General Weidling signed the surrender of the Berlin garrison to General Vasily Chuikov at the 8th Guards Army headquarters, which Chuikov had established in a housing development on the city's periphery. It was the same man who had signed the defense of Stalingrad 2.5 years earlier. The circle was closing. The figures for the Berlin operation in its entirety from the start on the Oder on April 16th until May 8th, 1945, when Germany signed the final surrender total, according to Soviet records cited by Beaver, 304,887 dead, wounded and missing on the 3 participating fronts, with the additional loss of 2,165 tanks and armoured vehicles, 1,220 guns and 527 aircraft. Only the fighting from the 16th to the 2nd of May produced 78,291 Soviet dead and 274,184 wounded. German military casualties are estimated at around 92,000 dead in the set of the Berlin operation. Civilian deaths in the city, many of them suicides, are between 20,000 and 50,000. From 1945 until today, around 1,000 corpses are discovered in Berlin excavations every year. On the slopes of the Silo Heights, in the pine forests south of the city, in the vacant lots where new buildings are constructed in the reunified capital. On May 1st, 1945, at 2:15 in the morning, the young announcer Richard Beyer presented the last broadcast of the Großdeutscher Rundfunk from the underground studio in Masurenalli. The transmitters at Tegel had been ignored by the Soviet advance. His script said, "The Führer is dead, long live the Reich." Beyer read the text, turned off the microphone, and went to sleep in a nearby basement. At that moment, the chief of the General Staff of the Wehrmacht, General Hans Krebs, crossed the Soviet lines under a flag of truce to present himself before General Chuikov with an armistice proposal. Krebs was one of the very few German generals who spoke Russian fluently, a product of his period as military attaché in Moscow in 1940. Chuikov received him at 4 in the morning. Krebs explained that Hitler was dead and that the Donetsk government proposed a temporary ceasefire to negotiate. Chuikov replied that he would only accept unconditional surrender. Krebs returned to the German lines. The negotiation failed. The final days of the battle had episodes that combined the most extreme violence with moments of disconcerting humanity. The writer Grossman, walking the city on May 2nd, observed German children playing in bomb craters while their mothers swept rubble from the sidewalk. He wrote in his notebook, "This happens at the very instant Berlin collapses." A few hundred meters away, according to his own records, there were corpses under collapsed walls. Soviet soldiers gave food rations to German civilians by order of General Berzarin, the first Soviet commander of the city. The same army that 3 days before had bombarded those streets now distributed bread. General Weidling signed the surrender that morning. But the war did not end for everyone at that moment. Outside the Berlin perimeter, the 9th German Division tried to fight its way west to surrender to the Americans on the Elbe rather than to the Soviets. The Halbe Forest, south of Berlin, was the scene of the last desperate combats of that force, which also included tens of thousands of civilians. Between 30,000 and 40,000 German dead, military and civilian, are calculated in the Halbe forests during those days. Still today, the Halbe Cemetery, with more than 28,000 identified, is the largest in Germany for victims of the Second World War. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed the final surrender of Germany on May 8, 1945, in Karlshorst in Berlin, before Marshal Zhukov, British Air Marshal Arthur Tedder, General Karl Spaatz of the United States and French General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny. Zhukov insisted that the signing take place in Berlin and not elsewhere. The capital of Germany was where the end of the Reich had to be sealed. Stalingrad. Nearly 2 million casualties in 200 days. Okinawa. Between 260,000 and 280,000 dead in 82 days. Berlin. Between 350,000 and 400,000 military and civilian casualties in 16 days of direct combat. They are numbers that paralyze, but all of them, the three together, represent a fraction of what occurred in the largest, longest and most lethal theatre of the entire Second World War, the Eastern Front. From June 22, 1941, when 3 million German soldiers and their allies crossed the Soviet border in the largest military operation in history, Operation Barbarossa, a code name taken from Emperor Frederick I Hohenstaufen, until May 9, 1945, when Germany signed the final surrender. The Eastern Front was the stage for something that has no precise name in Western textbooks. It was not just a war. It was the systematic destruction of a continent. In the first 3 days of Barbarossa, the Luftwaffe destroyed more than 2,000 Soviet aircraft, most on the ground, before they could take off. In the first week of combat, German forces caused 150,000 Soviet casualties. In the first 4 months, between June and October 1941, according to the Encyclopaedia Britannica, at least 4 million Soviet soldiers had been killed, wounded or captured. German losses in that period exceeded 700,000. And yet, the Red Army still existed. It kept fighting. The Battle of Kiev in September 1941 resulted in the capture of approximately 616,000 Soviet soldiers in a single encirclement operation. Most died in German prisoner of war camps in the winter of 1941 to 1942, where mortality rates exceeded 60%, in conditions that the Nuremberg trials themselves would later document as a result of deliberate extermination policy. The Battle of Moscow, fought between October and December 1941, involved more than 3 million soldiers from both sides in temperatures that fell to -40 degrees. German forces came to see the Kremlin domes through their binoculars before being repulsed by Marshal Zhukov's counter-offensive launched on December 5, 1941, 1 day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Moscow saved the Soviet Union in the most critical winter of the war, but it cost, on the Soviet side alone, around 926,000 casualties between September 30th and January 7th, according to Krivashev's data. The Battle of Kursk, in July 1943, was the largest concentration of armored forces in history. Germany deployed 2,700 tanks, 800,000 infantry soldiers and 2,000 planes in the attempt to cut the Soviet Kursk salient. The Soviet Union responded with 3,300 tanks, 1.5 million soldiers, and 2,400 planes. The fighting in the southern salient, where Field Marshal von Manstein's SS units reached furthest, involved the largest open-field clash of armor of the war. At Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, between 600 and 700 tanks from both sides clashed in a space of a few dozen square kilometers. The damage was enormous for both sides. In the end, Germany withdrew. And after Kursk, the Wehrmacht never again had strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. The Siege of Leningrad deserves a separate paragraph. On September 8, 1941, the German Army Group North closed the encirclement around the second city of the Soviet Union. 2.5 million inhabitants were trapped. What followed lasted 872 days until January 27, 1944. During the most terrible winter, that of 1941 to 1942, the daily bread ration for non-workers, elderly, children, unemployed fell to 125 grams, not 100, not 200, 125 grams of bread manufactured with flour, mixed with cellulose, sawdust, and any substance that gave volume, without immediately killing whoever ate it. That is approximately 300 daily calories. The human body needs between 2,000 and 2,500 calories to function. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, about 11,000 civilians died in Leningrad per month, most from hunger. There is documentation of cases of cannibalism. The Soviet police recorded more than 2,000 confirmed cases in the blockade archives. At the end of the siege, according to various sources, between 800,000 and 1 million civilians had died inside the besieged city, the vast majority by starvation. The writer Tanya Savicheva, 12 years old, kept a diary during the siege where she noted the deaths of each member of her family, one by one. The last entry said, "The Savichevs have died. Everyone has died. Only Tanya is left." Tanya herself was evacuated and died in July 1944 from the consequences of hunger and disease. Her diary is preserved in the Museum of the Siege of St. Petersburg and was used as evidence in the Nuremberg trials. Of the estimated 70 million deaths attributed to the Second World War in its entirety, more than 30 million occurred on the Eastern Front, according to the Pritzker Military Museum of Chicago, and most academic historians working with Soviet archives declassified since the fall of the USSR. The Soviet Union lost around 27 million people, including 8.7 million military and approximately 19 million civilians. Germany suffered between 5 and 6 million military deaths, with the vast majority on the Eastern Front. The German historian Rüdiger Overmans, in his work Deutsche militärische Verluste im Zweiten Weltkrieg, 1999, estimated total German military casualties at approximately 5.3 million dead. To put all that into perspective, the United States lost throughout the entire war, in all theaters of operation on the planet combined, approximately 400,000 men. The Soviet Union lost that amount in a few weeks during the worst moments of 1941 and 1942. The numbers of the Eastern Front cannot be separated from something that makes them unique in the history of modern war: the intent of extermination that accompanied military operations from the first day. The Commissar Directive, issued by the High Command of the Wehrmacht on June 6, 1941, ordered the immediate execution of all captured Soviet political commissars, denying them the status of prisoners of war guaranteed by the Geneva Convention. This directive was not the result of decisions made in the heat of combat. It was drafted, reviewed, signed and distributed in cold blood before the war began. The Hunger Plan, developed by the economic leadership of the Reich under the coordination of State Secretary Herbert Bacher between January and May 1941, established explicitly that the conquered Soviet territories were to supply food to the German army and the Reich population. The arithmetic consequence of this plan, calculated by its own authors, was death by starvation for tens of millions of people in the occupied territories. It was not an unwanted side effect. It was a planned and accepted result. The Nuremberg trial archives include memoranda where German planners discuss the figure of expected victims as if it were a logistical variable. Soviet prisoner of war camps on German and Polish territory had mortality rates of 60 to 70% in the winter of 1941 to 1942. Of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured during the entire war, between 3.3 and 3.5 million died in captivity. By comparison, of the 231,000 Anglo-American prisoners in German hands, approximately 8,000 died. The difference was not accidental. The Geneva Convention was applied to Western soldiers and was considered irrelevant for the subhumans of the East. Those are the words of Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg in internal memoranda from 1941. Soviet cities were not just military objectives. Leningrad was besieged deliberately, not to take it, but to kill its population. Manstein's plan for Leningrad proposed not to conquer the city, but simply to surround it and wait for its inhabitants to die. Hitler explicitly approved that strategy. When what to do if the Soviets offered surrender was discussed, the response in internal German high command documents was that it should not be accepted. A surrender would create the problem of feeding surviving civilians. Belarus lost, according to post-war demographic estimates, between 25 and 30% of its total population during the war, civilians included. This includes the mass executions of Jews during the Holocaust, the SS reprisals against villages accused of harboring partisans, the deportation of forced workers, and the deaths from hunger during the occupation. Russian-Belarusian historian Pavel Polyan estimated that in Belarus more than 2 million people died among the non-Jewish civilian population alone. The rest of the Belarusian dead, more than 500,000, were Jews murdered in the context of the Holocaust. In Ukraine, the landscape was similar or worse. Ukrainian territory was the scene of some of the largest concentrations of the Holocaust outside the Polish extermination camps. The Babi Yar massacres in Kiev, where in 2 days of September 1941 33,771 Jews were murdered by the SS Einsatzgruppen and auxiliary units, was only the best-known episode of a systematic campaign that stretched across Ukraine. And then there was the Soviet response, which also cannot be described as simply defensive. The mass deportations of populations considered politically unreliable Chechens, Crimean Tatars, Volga Germans, Koreans ordered by Stalin and executed by the NKVD during the war years caused between 500,000 and 1 million additional deaths. The Soviet penal battalions, the Strafbati, sent soldiers convicted of any military fault on almost suicidal frontline missions as a way to redeem themselves through blood. The Not a Step Back order of July 28, 1942. Stalin's order number 227 created blocking units that shot Soviet soldiers who retreated without orders. The Soviet military archives themselves, declassified after 1991, record more than 150,000 soldiers executed by their own commands during the entire war. The war in the East was not just a war between armies. It was a process of mass destruction in multiple simultaneous directions, with racial extermination as one of its layers and state terror as another. Having reached this point, the original question requires an honest answer, and that honesty implies not giving a single answer. If the metric is total deaths in a single geographically and temporally defined encounter, Stalingrad is the strongest candidate. Between 1.7 and nearly 2 million combined military casualties from both sides, plus tens of thousands of civilians, in 200 days in a city on the banks of a river. No other singular battle in the documented history of organized warfare approaches those figures. If the metric is the percentage of population destroyed and the convergence of extreme violence on civilians in the context of a single relatively short campaign, Okinawa wins by margins that are difficult to express with words. Between 22 and 33% of the entire population of the island dead in 82 days, many of them by suicide induced by the very state that should have protected them. And the decision that flowed directly from those 82 days, the use of atomic bombs killed another 200,000 people in 2 days in August 1945. If the metric is the intensity of violence per unit of time and space, Berlin in the last weeks of April and early May 1945 produces figures that have no comparison in the Western Hemisphere. More than 78,000 Soviet dead in 16 days of operation. More than 92,000 German dead in the same period. A city of 3 million inhabitants turned into a battlefield. and the mass rapes that Beaver documents up to 130,000 victims in just the two main Berlin hospitals, which represent a dimension of human cost that military statistics do not capture at all. And if the metric is the total scale of human suffering, deliberate destruction as a political instrument, and the number of dead as a result of decisions taken by states against populations, the Eastern Front as a whole has no competitor in any war in recorded history. More than 30 million deaths, the destruction of thousands of cities and towns, the demographic disappearance of entire generations in specific regions of Eastern Europe. Historians have tools to measure all this, but there is a dimension that no archive captures. The Ukrainian woman who hid her children under the floor so that soldiers would not find them. The 18-year-old German soldier who died in a bomb crater on the Silo Heights without having been able to vote in an election. The Okinawan mother who had to choose between handing over her daughter and seeing how they killed her or killing her herself. The Berlin civilian who emerged from his basement on May 3rd, 1945, when the artillery had already fallen silent, and found his street unrecognizable. Those people have no statistic, but they also counted. The question about which was the bloodiest battle is not an idle academic exercise. The fact that in the West, the D-Day of Normandy, which cost approximately 10,000 total Allied casualties on June 6, 1944, is the central image of the collective memory of the Second World War, while the battles of the Eastern Front, where the outcome of the war was decided and where approximately 80% of the German soldiers fallen in combat died, are known mainly by military history buffs, says something important about how we construct historical memory. It is not a moral criticism. It is an observation about the mechanisms of collective memory. We tend to remember the battles we can narrate from our own perspective, with our own heroes, with a clear beginning and end. Normandy fits that mold. The Eastern Front, with its incomprehensible scale, its fronts of thousands of kilometers, and its death counts that exceed any everyday frame of reference, resists the narrative. Historian Richard Overy, in his work Why the Allies Won, 1995, argues that the decision of the war was made in the East. That without the Soviet resistance in 1941 and 1942, there would have been no opportunity for landing in North Africa in November 1942, no D-Day in June 1944, no Italian campaign, no victory in the Atlantic that would have been worth anything. The causal chain is direct. If the Red Army had not stopped the Wehrmacht in Moscow in December 1941, in Stalingrad in February 1943, and in Kursk in July 1943, the Normandy landing would have been an operation against much more numerous and better positioned German forces. It probably would have failed. The same occurs with Okinawa and the Pacific. The bloodiest battle of that theatre does not appear in the same sentence as Pearl Harbor or Midway, which are the ones that defined the popular imaginary of the war in the Pacific. But Midway was a 4-day naval battle that cost, on the American side, 307 dead. Okinawa cost 12,500. The difference in scale is not reflected in the difference in cultural memory. And Berlin, the image of the red flag over the Reichstag, the photograph by Yevgeny Kalday, taken on May 2nd, 1945, which was partially retouched to remove the wristwatch that one of the soldiers was wearing on both wrists, and which suggested looting, is perhaps the most reproduced image of the end of the war in Europe. But very few people who know that photograph know General Weidling's name, or know that more than 1,000 corpses continue to appear every year in Berlin construction works. The image became fixed. The reality beneath it, not so much. The historian Antony Beaver, who spent years reading the diaries and letters of Soviet soldiers, Germans and civilians from both sides, notes in the preface to Berlin, The Downfall 1945, that the objective of his research was precisely that: to return to the dead, their individual dimension, their name, their specific fear, their particular reason for being in that place that day. Numbers are the structure. People are what fill that structure. The question has an answer. Only it has several, depending on what aspect of human horror you decide to measure. A single urban battle with strictly military criteria of total combined casualties. Stalingrad. The threshold of 2 million casualties in a limited space of time and geography has not been exceeded in the known history of organized warfare. Its 200 days produced more dead than the entire First World War on the Western Front. More dead than the entire North African, Italian and French campaigns combined for the Western Allies. A single theater for its impact on civilians in proportion to the total population affected. Okinawa. The percentage of civilian destruction in relation to the previous population has no equivalent in any battle of the Western Hemisphere of the war. And the shockwave of Okinawa changed the end of the conflict in the Pacific in a way that no other individual battle can claim. A single operation for its density of violence in the shortest time and its impact on the urban population. Berlin. More than 350,000 military and civilian casualties in 16 days in an urban space, with the addition of mass crimes that historiography took decades to fully document and that still today generate academic debate in Germany, Russia, and the Baltic countries. The total scale, the definitive weight, the number that crushes all others, the Eastern Front. More than 30 million deaths. The place where modern war showed what it could do when 20th century industrial technology combined with the political will to exterminate entire populations. The place where Nazi ideology and the Stalinist system met in the most destructive combat of human history. The Second World War did not have a single bloodiest battle. It had a region of the world turned into an abyss for 4 years. And within that abyss, specific moments: Stalingrad, Okinawa, Berlin, where the concentration of human violence upon itself reached extremes that still today, 80 years later, resist any attempt at comfortable understanding. Paulus wrote from his captivity in the Soviet Union in 1943. It has been 2 years since the Stalingrad catastrophe, and at this moment, all of Germany is becoming a gigantic Stalingrad. He had said it to other German prisoners in his cell, whose walls had NKVD microphones. The conversation was transcribed and sent to Beria. Beria left it on Stalin's desk. Stalin read those words and responded nothing. He did not need to. He was right. The dead do not compete with each other for the title of the bloodiest battle. They have no such interest. But historians have the obligation to count them all, and we have the obligation to listen to the count.